All right. Hello, everyone. We'll kick it off. I'm Valerie Boyd, Director for the Center for Presidential Transition at the Partnership for Public Service. We are pleased to join Protect Democracy in hosting the event this morning. We want to welcome the partnership staff and close friends in the room and all of our guests for joining virtually online. It is a challenge to host an event in the middle of August, and so we are pleased to be broadcasting live and preparing a tape for later for all of our colleagues to see when they're back from doing things that are more fun.
Could be more fun.
And what could be more important? So one of the reasons the Center for Presidential Transition exists is to help presidential candidates and their teams with the resources they need to be prepared to govern. And there might be no way this is more important than being prepared to guide the country through national security risks. The center is releasing a short report today in which we review case studies of national security threats facing new presidents early in their administrations and making recommendations about the way early planning can help them be prepared to navigate the country through them. I want to recognize Sasha Blockman, Paul Hitlin, Mia Imperato, and Marissa Brophy for authoring this report for us. The reason that we're here today is to hear from some exceptional public servants and leaders from their own experience about the national security risks facing new administrations and how to fulfill what the country needs from its leaders during those moments. In addition to their own careers, the experts here today represent a combination of bodies of expertise, including Count Every Hero, a nonpartisan initiative of Protect Democracy, whose retired admirals and generals and former service secretaries of the U.S. Armed Forces work to promote the understanding of the importance of a strong democracy to our national security. They also represent the Partnership of Public Service Board of Directors and the Partnership Strategic Advisors to Government Executives Program, or SAGES, who lend their knowledge and insights to help senior leaders navigate the complex federal environment. So in alphabetical order, I will introduce our guests. We have Admiral Thad Allen, the former Commandant of the Coast Guard, best known for leading the country through the response to Hurricanes Katrina and Rita and the Deepwater Horizon oil spill. We have Secretary Luis Caldera, who served as Secretary of the Army and Director of the White House Military Office, and now teaches at his alma mater, Harvard Business School. And we have Undersecretary Claire Grady, who has a long career in acquisitions and overall management at the Departments of Defense and Homeland Security, and whom I got to see manage the full gamut of preparedness, response, and operational issues as Acting Deputy Secretary at the Department of Homeland Security. And last but not least, we have Secretary Sean O'Keefe, who served as Comptroller of the Department of Defense, Secretary of the Navy under President George H.W. Bush, and NASA Administrator during the George W. Bush administration. And conveniently, you sat in alphabetical order too. So we'll turn to a series of questions to organize the conversation. I think we'll plan to talk for about 45 minutes and then take questions from our audience in person and online. I'll start by directing questions to one of you, but hope that we have an open, wide-ranging conversation. So please pitch in where your experience and opinions warrant it. So I'll start with Secretary O'Keefe with the sort of baseline question of why we're here today, which is why are election years and times of presidential transition a particularly vulnerable time for our country's national security?
Well, it's a particularly difficult time, I think, for outgoing administrations to have their mind on the notion that you've got to pass along in a structured way, a good situation awareness of where the threats are, what the issues are, what the efforts have been made to try to counter what are anticipated kinds of vulnerabilities during an election, transition period of time. That's the stage in which everybody is moving. So it's a great opportunity for those who seek disruption to step into that. And so it's also a difficult time for the incoming administration. to really focus attention away from all the campaign rhetoric and into the business governance and trying to understand what it takes in order to really understand the scope of the entire federal expanse and put it to good service in those cases in which there is little to no notice on what the nature of those threats may be when they materialize. And we've emerged to a point where there is no one department or agency of the federal government that will exclusively manage or deal with any individual threat. It is really a much more complicated set of situations where there's always a range of coordination requirements among different agencies and departments that have an expertise that will be most necessary, particularly in cases in which you don't anticipate the nature of the problem going forward. So it's a particularly tough, vulnerable period of time. As those who are distracted about getting on with the rest of their lives with something else, and those coming in who have maybe a working knowledge, but not as strong as it needs to be to understand the functions of what the levers of governance require to be responsive.
You know, first of all, I want to commend the report that the partnership wrote in the Center for Presidential Transition. It's a very good report, and it highlights what some of these challenges are, including you've got a new team on the field. They haven't been confirmed in many cases. They haven't worked together as a team, and so our adversaries in the world, anyone who has malignant intent, whether it's against the U.S. or against some neighboring country in a way that's going to be destabilizing to the world order, knows that this transition is happening and could pinpoint and say they won't have their act together. This is a good time for us to do something because they're going to be on their back heels in terms of, you know, what are the options for response? How should we respond? What is this going to do to our agenda that we ran on? You know, all of those kinds of issues. So I think you've highlighted some other reasons that, you know, for people who want to know more to go and look at the report.
Thank you for that. Well, I want to talk about how some of the themes in the report relate to your personal experience. And you mentioned the theme on vacancies and the need for new teams to have time to cohere together. There's a theme about sifting through competing advice and sort of understanding whose voices to trust. And kind of establishing clear lanes of leadership to pivot to respond to unforeseen crises. So this might be a tougher question, but hopefully we've given you some time to think through your experience. Could we start with Undersecretary Grady and ask what have been the biggest challenges in your experience, and what advice do you have for new administrations?
Absolutely. And I think one of the things that sets the national security enterprise apart is everybody realizes it's a no-fail mission. And if something's going to happen or there's a risk of something that's going to happen, it is all hands on deck. And everybody puts mission first, outcomes first. And I think that's something that's brilliant and a testament to the strength of our organizations, the commitments individuals have to achieve the outcomes we want for our nation. But it is challenging during a transition. Outgoing administration, you have individuals who are leaving with their corporate knowledge. Over time, people have opportunities to move on. You have people who are acting sometimes 1, 2, 3, even 4 levels above where they would normally appear in an organizational structure. So the breadth of their responsibility has shifted. You also have people coming in with no matter how much experience somebody has, the second you leave the building, your knowledge starts to decay. You don't have the same situational awareness. It is not coming into the exact same situation you may have left. And there are all-stars who are coming in on these teams, but they haven't played together. So, you know, your analogy would be an all-star game for professional sports. They are not playing at the level that individual teams are, even though they're bringing tremendous capability. And throughout this, and I think the report did a good job of highlighting this, the importance of career officials through the transition. There is tremendous knowledge and capability there, and that is captured not only in the documentations and processes, but knowledge of the advice they've provided previously and providing that information so that people know that they have a range of options as you're dealing with something. And getting people in and getting people up to speed on situations is critically important. And one of my favorite quotes about intelligence is it gives you the option to act before events dictate. And that's really the value of intelligence, the range of options you have to respond. I've seen just tremendous things. I've seen people who were career, went political and stayed career to make sure that there was continuity. I've seen career officials, one of whom's in the room today, step up in multiple of roles to make sure that absolutely the business of government, and when I say that, I don't mean just the pure mechanics of it, but the actual accomplishment of objectives is achieved. So people really are committed, people are really dedicated, and during transitions, people go out to lunch or dinner with the person that they're replacing. It's not just the 4-inch thick binder that you get given to say this is everything you need to know before you come in. First of all, it's not true. Second of all, that's a lot to get through. But it really is, people are dedicated to making that happen, and people really do care about our nation and the success of our nation, and that comes through. So regardless of political parties, sometimes things go better or worse. You have an outgoing administration who's focused on achieving the last of their objectives before they leave, and you have an incoming administration who's very focused on what they committed to and how they want to move forward and govern. But it works, and that's the joy of the democracy, is that transition of power occurs, but it is a seam that creates an opportunity for others to exploit. But it's tremendous how people weave together to try and cover over that seam. But it is a vulnerability, and it is a vulnerable time.
And I think I hear you saying that officials in the national security space might feel that commitment even more than the average public servant, who also knows that their mission is critical to pass on.
Absolutely. I mean, they're not 9-to-5 jobs. People step up in tremendous ways. You see people make incredible commitments. I saw several political appointees stay over from Bush through Obama to close to 100 days, if not longer, to make sure you had that continuity. Other thing that I think I've seen, particularly at Homeland Security, is designation of positions that are career, to make sure you have that continuity. The Deputy Undersecretary for Management is a career position. The Deputy Undersecretary for Policy is a career position. So you have individuals, if they're filled, that are there to help provide that continuity and that commitment to ensuring things go as seamlessly as possible. But it's bumpy. Everybody's getting used to what they're doing and how they can contribute and how they can function well as a team. And the point about which voices to trust, you're hearing from new people, and you don't have those relationships built up the way you will over time.
So I think we'll want to draw on the thread of the importance of the career workforce throughout this conversation. I might turn to Admiral Allen and ask about an op-ed he wrote on the 20th anniversary of 9/11 in Homeland Security Today. The last theme of our paper examines how outgoing presidents set expectations for information sharing and coordination with a new team. And Admiral Allen kind of wrote this well when he said, he's observed a concerning and deepening trend with the transitions that he's been part of since 1992, that transition should not be an afterthought following victory. It should be a demonstrated competency of campaigns. Political discord and lost institutional memory threaten our readiness and resiliency. So I wanted to ask you all, starting with Admiral Allen, what type of leadership do you want to see from outgoing and incoming teams?
Well, I think it has to be a balance. I mean, obviously, we live in a political world. There are campaigns. There are ideas and concepts that are embraced, and people support those, and that's the basis on which people make decisions on who they're going to vote for. But they're not self-executing. You have to figure out a way to actually get the wheels of government turning so you can actually produce the outcomes. That doesn't happen overnight. And as you noted in the op-ed that I wrote on the anniversary of 9/11, since 1992, every single one of our transitions has been to the other party. The last same party transition we had was George H.W. Bush succeeding President Reagan. So you have the added tension of varying political viewpoints that start to color the processes that need to be there as far as briefing the new people, looking at contingency plans and how you're going to manage that. And one of the points that I tried to make in the article that I wrote was, in my view, starting with the one that I was involved in 1992, there's been a general erosion that we haven't been able to recover from each one of those successive transitions. And some of that you can mitigate, and the partners have been very good about pushing for more career positions in the SES world to be able to create that kind of continuity. But I think the American public should expect competency and the ability to actually govern, not just campaign. And I make a distinction between those two in the article that I wrote. I think it's even more critical more recently because the increased political discord and the polarization of thinking, the level of trust that needs to be established to hand this stuff off becomes extraordinarily important. And regardless of where you sit politically, I like to go back to Maslow's hierarchy of needs. The bottom is food, clothing, and shelter, and government has to keep running. People have to come in, somebody has to cut the Social Security checks and run all the elements of government. And you can't start to put all that at risk because you're campaigning, not governing. And more we're seeing risks that are agnostic to any kind of political viewpoint and actually agnostic to borders, weather, germs, the internet, space weather, on and on and on. Over.
You said space weather, and that is my single greatest fear, is a solar flare that ends electricity and civilization as we know it. The gamut of threats is large and can surprise us at any moment. So there's some more thought leadership this group did. I think last year, the Count Every Hero co-chairs co-authored an op-ed on the importance of the peaceful transfer of power to national security. And in particular, you described the importance of the cohesion between civil society and the military for the stability of the country and the ability of presidents to respond to risks. So I wanted to ask Secretary Caldera, for civilian leaders who take the mantle of governing and will work closely with military leadership, what's important for them to understand, and what should they do to make this cohesion last?
Thank you for that question. You know, and you mentioned at the beginning that Count Every Hero also has as one of its core principles that a vibrant democracy is critical to our national security. And actually, you know, if I step back, it is an unbelievable privilege to be a service secretary, to work in the Department of Defense, to help lead our country's national security. And when you travel the world, you realize how much other countries look to the U.S. for leadership to solve challenges that they're facing wherever they are. And one of the things we try to communicate to them is the value of a strong democracy. This is why we promote democracy. And the value of the way we have organized our Department of Defense, which is civilian control of the military. That is, that the military shouldn't run the country. It should be responsive to the elected officials who were chosen by the people to lead the country. And so when you think in that kind of context, as you're doing this transition, there has to be trust, respect, and a close working relationship between those civilian officials who are appointed by the president to be his representative. So he's the elected leader, and presumably they're acting in concert with the kinds of policies he ran on, his beliefs, her beliefs about the nation. And those individuals ought to come in with a sense of appreciation for the knowledge and expertise of those career military leaders who've spent 30, 40 years protecting our country. And they also have to have that respect for the civilian chain of command. They will give you incredible sets of options about use of force, other ways of dealing with evolving situations in the world, but they're not the ones who should make the decisions about which of those options to select. It's really the president, the president's team, thinking in this interagency way about, is a diplomatic response more appropriate? Are economic sanctions more appropriate? A low level of engagement versus a high level of engagement? Multilateral with many countries and building a strong coalition? And ultimately, how does response in this particular context make sense given the other kinds of things we're trying to accomplish, both in the national security sphere and in our domestic priorities, right? And those are policy decisions. Those belong in the political civilian side. But both of them have to work very, very closely together with that kind of trust and respect and honesty about understanding the different perspectives they bring together so that we can make the best decisions. Those who are responsible, who've been entrusted by the American people through their votes and through these appointments, make the best decisions for the country, at that moment, based on that, leveraging that deep military experience, but also understanding as a representative of the person elected on a certain kind of platform with a certain view of the world and how to protect our country's interests and security in the world, what the best decision is in that moment.
No, if I could just add to that, I think Lewis and I tend to agree on just about everything except the outcome, the desired outcome of the Army-Navy game every December, okay? I mean, that's it. But otherwise, we've got exactly the same, kind of framework to this. But I would expand this just a touch to really incorporate some of the comments that you introduced in the first, few questions, and particularly the last, as it pertains to the responsibility of the career civilian side of the equation. That is much the same as what we're looking at, and I think Lewis spoke to very eloquently about the military responsibilities and that focus that needs to be more on the operational option side than it does on the policy framework. And that is the same distinction in many ways on the career civilian side. I had the privilege of working in 2 administrations in which it was impressed upon us with great regularity from none less than the 2 presidents themselves, who stressed that all of us, every single one of us, are public servants first and foremost. And how you got there and for how long you'll be in that capacity, that's a different question. But in terms of your responsibilities, it has to be the same. And you've got to view every public servant in that organization as those who are there for a reason, and they're there to contribute their expertise that they've been trained for, that they've developed expertise over the course of their professional lives, whether it's in uniform or as career force folks. And either direction of that doesn't differentiate at all what an appointee ought to view as the responsibility to be a public servant first and foremost. Not allegiant to an individual, not allegiant to, the political process. No, you're there for the purpose of being a public servant to advance the benefit of all citizens. And that's a critical feature. And somehow we've kind of lost that. There's more of this notion of division between transitions because of what party affiliate. That has nothing to do with it. The responsibilities at every one of these phases is what policies you're going to pick up. Sure, those were framed by what those campaign contexts may provide for, but you've got to utilize exactly the same depth of talent that the last administration had to rely on. Because when you get right down to it, there aren't enough folks that come in on a very short-term basis or ill-defined basis of how long their term of service will be as appointees. Less than 3,000 of them. There's 1 million career, public servants, and not quite that many in uniform as well. There's no logic to this. that somehow you're going to have a very scant, small number of people who will have exclusive responsibility going forward or knowledge going forward. You've got to develop this on the basis of, what Stan McChrystal used to call the team of teams. You've really got to understand how that collective is going to apply to a solution.
There's a couple of threads to follow now, and I want to kind of follow up and talk about the themes of strong leadership, where we've seen that happen well during transitions. I don't want to get too far from Secretary Caldera's point about the way that the military advice feeds into the presidency and the decision making about different options. And our report starts with a case study of the Bay of Pigs during the Kennedy presidency, and there was a little bit of question of why something so old, but really that situation where President Kennedy came into office and was faced with sort of competing advice, people that he knew well, people that he didn't. That challenge really led to the creation of the national security interagency process as we know it now, and so it really shaped the way we make decisions. So I wonder if do we see this system evolving over time? Do you see an ability for those competing voices in the Situation Room to be heard and play together to help support the president in the ultimate decisions that he or she might make?
If I can, I'll happy to start with on that, and others can jump in. I think so. First of all, our world is growing increasingly complex, and so therefore we have to find these ways to work, not just in interagency well, but also tapping into civilian expertise that exists in research centers and universities and other places when these kinds of questions come up. One of the things that I think our country has been very good at is self-criticism. So even after the success of World War II, we turned around and said we weren't as effective as we could have been. We need to create the Department of Defense and better integrate how we're going to operate. And at many different points, we've stopped and said, what led to this failure, such as Bay of Pigs, is because we don't have the right groups providing the president advice. And so it was channeled in one direction, and he wasn't hearing other people who would have had reservations about that particular plan. We need a different structure for generating that kind of advice. And part of to make that work, again, to go back to the earlier theme, and I think one of the things that, when I also commend the partnership for is we need really smart, bright, committed individuals in our civil service, in our government, whether it's in uniform, whether it's as diplomats, whether it's as Department of Defense civilians. We need really great people. Their morale, their training, their retention is really critical. And, we saw in the last administration, when people are demoralized, they leave, and we lose a lot of people we don't want to lose, because we want to keep the value of their expertise, even as we bring new people in and new blood, into this system. So, but it only helps you to have them there. These Russia experts and experts in weapons of mass destruction and environmental issues, if you're going to tap their expertise and help it inform the decisions that you're making.
I would add on to that, maybe extending the DoD analogy a little further up. After the failed rescue of the Iranian hostages, we had the Goldwater-Nichols Act. There was also some other issues related to our operations in Panama and Grenada that produced the joint combatant commander concept that we have right now in a unified command plan. That said, that was a major step forward, and it's been very successful as we've had to navigate a lot of national security issues. But increasingly, we're starting to encounter threats that are agnostic to physical borders. So for cybersecurity, you still have the same problem. It's a complex situation, whereas, as Sean O'Keefe said, there are a lot of players in there. Nobody owns the singular problem and how to fix it. If you have a missile launch in China and it goes terminal in the United States, there are 4 or 5 combatant commanders that get involved in that decision-making process. So the issue is, how do you continue to evolve that to make it more agile, flexible, to address what is the real risk factor and its complexity? More complexity regarding the organizational structure and more complexity regarding the threat. And I would say cybersecurity is a good example of that right now. I remember talking to a very senior administration official who had been the director of national intelligence, head of NSA at one point, and he kept talking about a cyber Pearl Harbor. And I said, I don't worry about a cyber Pearl Harbor, because we should expect there'll be an attack and it should not be a surprise. What bothers me is a cyber Desert One, which is a failed rescue of the Iranian hostage, about who's in charge, what are the respective roles, how do we coordinate this? Because in the absence of the ability to do that in a structured manner, it defaults back to the National Security Council and the White House and the dreaded 5,000-mile screwdriver that everybody in the military hates.
And I think that's a really great point, because it's the velocity of decision making, and it's time is a resource, especially when you're dealing with a national security incident, and particularly when you're looking at range of options. And that's one of the challenges when you're dealing with a new team who are less familiar with each other and less familiar with processes and refining those processes. I think there have been some great steps forward in terms of running tabletop exercises, and trying to get with ingoing and outcoming. But even then, and this is regardless of administration, convincing some of the incoming people that this takes precedence over selling your house, last State of the Union for whatever state you're a governor of, et cetera, in terms of, no kidding, this is really important, and you need to flex that muscle and exercise that muscle before you're in a crisis, because there's going to be a crisis, and you could say, here are the top 5 we think it might be. It's going to be something else. It's just almost inevitable, but it's a very volatile world. A lot's happening domestically, internationally, and things happen in concert with partners and adversaries that people need to be able to address. You can't be ready for every scenario, but you can be ready for processes and how you're going to work together to address it, and help to start understanding the authorities. And that's an area where your career civilian and your career military are absolutely essential in terms of helping to provide ranges of authorities to then make decision and advice. And once you're in that situation room, you're providing the best advice for the country, not for you, not for your department, but how are we going to achieve the outcome? And people, I think, really do approach it with that focus, but that starts with the exercise and knowing who's involved. If you don't want to not know who to call, that when something bad is about to happen, that's the last thing you want to do, is be scrambling. Until you build those relationships, that first practice is really important, and that's been something that is now in law, and I think that's absolutely critical.
And if I could just to add one critical feature to that, is the clarity of decision making from the only vote that matters. Okay. In the entire coordination process of the National Security Council, there's only one vote, only one. And the president has to make that determination. But if the NSC is, and its processes for formulating those options, as she just described, if they aren't clear in terms of the directions they can be chosen for, what you end up with is an awful lot of ambiguity. And this is the reason why the NSC was created in the first place. Eisenhower's frustration with the idea that everybody would come into his office individually and offer their view, and he'd be the action officer. This was not the way this was designed to go, and not what the president can possibly synthesize on everything involved. This has got to be something served up that's going to be a clear set of options that you choose this approach, or that. And that's ultimately what makes that process work. I guess I never really appreciated as much as I did in the weeks and months that followed 9/11. I was a member of the Deputies Committee of the National Security Council, having been the deputy director at OMB on the White House staff at that time. And I remember spending a lot of quality time with my friend Steve Abbott, who is the deputy advisor to the president on Homeland Security advisory issues before the department was ever made. And the amount of time we spent working each day with multiple sessions in order to serve up those clear options for the president to make was the most time consuming of all things involved. Getting all the facts on the table, different perspectives from all the elements of the governance structure that need to input to that is critical. But then you've got to organize it in a way that's going to be an informed, clear set of choices. And that's the brilliance of so much of what this evolved National Security Council process has yielded, is that kind of a possibility to make this a more responsive set of conditions where no one individual department is going to have the recognizance of dealing with the solution going forward.
And I would add the bulk of the staffing in the National Security Council are career civilian and military people who are detailed there. So the notion in a transition, you can't lean on those people is kind of ludicrous. But the problem is there's a referendum on who do you trust and how are we going to do this? But I can tell you, having worked through these transitions since 1992, that staff is the most competent tool a new administration has to deal with these problems that are going to be foisted on them, and they won't know exactly which, as we said, you don't know which problem is going to arrive. But we've got to create the ability to pass the credibility and confidence of the career staff between administrations.
You're pointing out how we have several people here today who we could pull up on stage with us. Admiral Steve Adbit snuck into the room, but certainly talk about standing up a new structure after a major crises in the country, standing up the Homeland Security Council at the White House after 9/11. And Patty Cogswell, who led some of the most challenging issues at the NSC, and Martha Kumar, who wrote the book on the 2008 transition and the gold standard that it set in terms of cooperation between incoming and outgoing administrations. I'll say to the folks here on stage that you're representing some of the ways that the government has reorganized itself to handle cross-cutting threats across 70 years ago with the Department of Defense, 20 years ago with the Department of Homeland Security. We talked a little about the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. Our report talks about this too briefly. The 1993 World Trade Center bombing posed a surprise to the US government about the threat of domestic terrorism here on our soil, and how in the moment the government responded through the Department of Justice and prosecuting Ramzi Youssef and the co-conspirators, and then later after 9/11 kind of examined the need for a really massive reorganization. So there's so many themes we could follow here. I do want to kind of go back to that point about cooperation, the 2008 gold standard. Talk to you a little bit more about your experience seeing the good faith of career civil servants. It was kind of holding together, preparing that information, as Undersecretary Grady said, meeting or political appointees meeting with their incoming and outgoing counterparts to share information. There's one more person who really exemplifies this mindset, Steve Hadley, President Bush's Homeland Security advisor, recently declassified all of the transition memos that his NSC prepared for the incoming Obama team, and prepared a book called Handoff that really examined whether the outgoing Bush administration did its job in preparing the Obama administration and future presidents to handle the foreign affairs and national security crises facing us. So there's kind of a lot to unpack there, but where have you seen great leadership in this regard?
Could I make just one really important point about the 2008 transition? And I want to acknowledge and celebrate President Bush, because processes mean nothing without character and leadership. And he did what I hope we should expect all presidents of regardless of party to do, which is if they lose the election, to congratulate the winner and to say, what can I do to help you be successful because it's important for our country. And so that was a tough loss for him to lose a re-election. And yet that's exactly what he did. And he said to his staff, campaign's over, let's have a successful transition, give them every opportunity to get off to the best start that they can. And that was exemplified by the way his chief of staff worked with John Podesta, who was organizing the transition for President-elect Obama. And I was part of that transition team at the Department of Defense. And it makes a world of difference. And even if defense and some of those issues were part of the turf that was hard fought over the campaign, is to bury that stuff. And let's figure out, both sides still have lots of responsibilities, and they have their personal issues that they're dealing with. Do we pay the tuition for next semester? Are we still going to be here next year? What's going to be my job? There's no transition policy. There's no one to help you, and no additional pay the day the administration ends. You have to find that next job on your own, and there's no more compensation. And so of course many people are starting to think like, boy, I better go find my next job. Should I be interviewing? What should I be doing? And as a leader, I was saying as much as I could, keep your eye focused on the work we're trying to accomplish before the end of administration, but respecting these were people who'd worked really hard. And if they needed to leave or take a job or whatever they needed to do, to also be respectful and supportive of them if that was a decision they made, right? So all these things are going on, but that tone at the top is so critical. And we're going to have contested elections. We're going to have Republican presidents and Democratic presidents, and we may yet have presidents of other parties or independents. Doesn't matter who it is. We have to get back to this part about we are all Americans. We want our country to succeed. The American people have spoken. Whatever decision they made, the right thing to do for a loser of an election is to congratulate the winner and then help them make a good transition. It doesn't matter if you're a governor or president or what it is, right? And so without that, the rest of it just isn't going to work well. But if you have that, then you've really set the stage for having a successful transition. And I think some of the work that you're doing in the transition in this project is really helpful because, for example, even in that transition, there was a period of time, I was called on election day saying, can you be here by the weekend to start working on transition? So I was there by the weekend. I cleared my calendar for the next couple of months. But when we got there, there was still about a week of like, hurry up and wait, because the agreements hadn't been signed. At the White House level, they hadn't been signed at the Department of Defense level. You're dealing with national security secrets, and you're dealing with personnel records, and there are laws about how to deal with those things. So the outgoing group, they don't want to just say, well, here, we're just going to hand you all this information. They want to make sure that they're doing it the right way. And the incoming group needs the right clearances and agreements and all those kinds of things. A lot of that could be worked out earlier in model frameworks that you could help prepare, so that we keep shortening that time for every single transition. And then people, can get to work with the right perspective, the right attitude, the right leadership, to get that transfer of information, understanding that that's the right thing to do for the country.
If I could add an anecdote, when I was sent down to replace Mike Brown in New Orleans following the Katrina landfall, we had a curious problem in Alabama where there were shrimp boats pushed up into the woods. Didn't present a threat to public safety. There wasn't any threat of pollution, and there weren't any funds that could be used to do anything about those boats for their owners. And I got a call from Fran Townsend basically saying the governor of Alabama is all over the president. You got to fix this. Got in a plane, I flew to Houston, and I met with Bush 41. And Bush 41 and President Clinton's fund covered it. I don't know how that happens. The pre-need relationships that allow them to come together and produce that kind of charitable work they did, which has been applied to disasters all over the world. So just underscoring the point of having the comedy and the relationship established regarding your political affiliation.
And I wanted to go a slightly different direction because I am a huge fan, was a career civil servant, huge fan of career civil servants. They step up time and again, but we owe it to them to get the permanent leadership in place. They step up and do superhuman work, but they're in an acting capacity or performing the duties of. I became way too much of an expert on the Vacancy Act as we're trying to maneuver who could be where, and after 210 days, but if you have a nominee, blah, 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 blah. It's important to get the team in place, and either quicker confirmations or fewer positions that require confirmations would be beneficial, and I know that came out in the report. It's important, and full respect for the branches of government and the checks and balances that we have with the advice and consent of the Senate, fully understand that, but do we have that at the right level and the right number of positions? And I think that's something that needs to be considered, particularly, unfortunately, given the gridlock we've seen in multiple Congresses to get people through. And 2 years in, when people are still sitting with a large number of vacancies, that's a problem. And it puts people in a position of uncertainty, continuous transition, and doesn't allow us to do good for our country the way you could if you're in there. And quite frankly, being short a critical player on a team is always a problem. It's great that somebody's stepping up, but you have people who have unique skills that can step in and fill those leadership positions. And how do we facilitate making that happen in a timely manner, I think is a really important question.
If I could just add one point to that, I think you're right on the mark, Claire. This is something where the United States Senate, I mean, to be very blunt about it, has always afforded to each of its members the prerogative to object to an individual nominee, a member, whatever, that may not necessarily comport with the policy point of view they'd like to see espoused. They have an opportunity to air that. And then to remedy the situation, having aired their grievance on this point, they have an obligation to let that governance process move forward. That has broken down badly. In the last 35 years, it has turned into a mud fight over every single confirmable appointee. And it's not unique to one administration or one party or the other. Sadly, this is something that has occupied the attention of all the members of the Senate to believe that this is a great way to exercise leverage over something that has got nothing to do, in many cases, with the portfolio of the individual who's being held up. It's now being extended to military officers. The United States Navy and then the United States Marine Corps are both operating today with military leadership that is in an acting capacity in their roles as the number two of those two services, of course. And that is mercifully one that makes a little more sense. But nonetheless, it was driven to that position as the president was in terms of the nominations to be forwarded on the basis of the fact that that's now been held up since March. Okay, so for 6 months, we're talking about a debate that neither one of those positions have anything to do with the grievance that's being aired. And I mean, the fact that it's extending to these levels has become something that it's an abuse of what an authority is and what a prerogative is, something designed initially to represent the rights of every member, to have an appropriate airing of concerns, to reach a consensus, even with those concerns in mind. That was the intentions. And that's now to something well beyond that. So this is something where this is not uniquely something an administration can remedy by speeding up the appointments or slowing it down or changing more of them to one variety of appointment term or not. This is something that has to be taken on as a whole of government solution to include the Congress and particularly the Senate and the leadership of both parties to concur that this is a critical leadership concern. Is during this period of time of transitions, it's super profound. Is you're really looking at a long delay that goes into any individual, responsibility below that of a cabinet member rank.
There's so much to follow up on there, and there's a few more things I want to ask, but I am obligated to check in and see what questions we have from our team in the room or from online.
If folks are online, you're welcome to submit questions in the chat, but if there's anyone in the room with a question, we'd be happy to go there first.
Admiral Abbott.
I'm not a plant. I'd like to follow up on this discussion, but also it was a topic that was really broached, I think, by Secretary Caldera about the fact that, the country has a good track record of learning from past mistakes. And many would say that the last transition presented some opportunities for improvements, and I know the report discusses some of that. Could there be some additional mention of things that might in fact be considered as improvements to structure, process, law that could help with the transition process?
Well, I think specifically what the Partnership for Public Service has been doing with legislative form regarding the role of GSA and kind of coming up with an ecumenical way to fund transition processes, and started earlier in campaigns. So somebody is thinking about the transition to governing, and to be able to facilitate that with legislation, then a source of funds that can actually resource it, I think is a huge step forward. And I congratulate the partnership for what they've been doing. I think we need to keep moving in that direction.
I would highlight two things that Congress did as a result of the last election and last transition. One was that there were some flaws in the Electoral College Count Act about how you transmit the electoral votes of the states and count them, where the language was a little bit vague, had never been tested, and some of that vagueness is part of what allowed President Trump and some of his supporters to argue that things like that Mike Pence, that Vice President Pence would be able to make a determination about which electoral ballots to count and which not to. And in the Electoral College Reform Act, bipartisan measure, which Congress passed this past year, they foreclosed they clarified some of those provisions to eliminate the vagueness that allowed arguments to be made about how the election could continue to be contested. There was also a problem in that there was a process that up to now had been very ministerial, that when one particular individual at the GSA, the Government Service Association, which provides things like technology support, office space, et cetera, ascertained that there was a winner of the election, they would free funds to the winning candidate to be able to set up a transition office. And so a lot of pressure was put on that person not to ascertain that President-elect Biden was in fact the president-elect. And so Congress also clarified that so that that money and that support for the transition team would flow faster, and that if for any reason there was still a dispute about who had won, perhaps some litigation in some particular state that still had been unresolved about the outcome of the election in that state, that both campaigns would get that funding. What ended up happening in the Biden campaign is that they had to go out and raise private money to start funding the transition process for a long time, but they couldn't get into the agencies to start doing the actual transition work. So that the period of time between the end of the election and the installation of the president is really actually fairly short to start getting all those people in place, to start doing all the transition work that has to happen. And if the election is in dispute or any part of it, and it isn't settled who the president-elect is, then it compresses that time even further. That's not to our country's advantage. So I think those things that the Congress did in passing the Electoral College Reform Act and improving the clarity, I think those will also go a long way to try to make sure that we don't have another kind of election of the kind that we just went through.
Completely agree with the comments.
We do have a question from a virtual attendee, and this is for all the panelists. Any thoughts on interagency coordination, DoD, intelligence community, DHS, state, DOE, ahead of and during a transition?
Well, based on the transitions that I've observed, there is a structure and it's become more formalized to bring these various entities together and do tabletop exercises, mostly managed by the National Security Council, to go ahead and put these people in place and actually walk through situations they might encounter, probably the most probable ones, not everyone, but as has been stated several times, the pre-need relationships that you establish in doing the work and the planning and the exercises create the relationships you're going to need when something happens. I think President Eisenhower once said, plans are nothing, planning is everything. And the more we can ingrain that doctrinally, an accepted principle by everybody, that that's the right way to do it, then we're going to have more people involved, because even when they set up these exercises, you may or may not get a principal there. You may send a representative when you actually have the event. The principal is not aware of what's going on. You're going to still have ambiguity or lack of clarity in what it is you're trying to do. So I would continue to evolve that process, formalize it, and have it become accepted doctrine by both parties.
You know, people may not realize it, but the outgoing administration, I believe, in particular in the President Bush case, that agency leaders were writing memo about these are the biggest challenges you're going to face. Successor, here's the status of some of the biggest things that we're working on, biggest challenges that you're going to face. What the agency review teams do, the transition teams that are working transition, they're not necessarily, one or two or three of them may go into the agency. A lot of them are not going to go into the agency. They're just helping assess what the agencies is, and what they'll write their reports also. Here are the key vacancies you need to fill, maybe in priority order of how you ought to try to fill them, given the challenges. Here are the biggest challenges that they're currently dealing with, all the way to future-looking things, such as you ran saying that we need to pivot to Asia. Here's what here are some options or ways to think about how to put into practice the commitments that the president made during the campaign about these particular areas. You know, there was a question about second term transition from an administration to a continuity of the administration. By the second administration, they should have a pretty good team in place, even though some are going to turn over. And some of those longer term things, you know, initially they were putting out the fires, they were getting their sea legs. By the second term, they should be able to be turning to some of those, like, oh, and we also wanted to do some reorganization, some thinking through of longer term challenges that the country is going to be facing, and ways in which our security agencies need to evolve, or our cooperation need to evolve. Let's re-energize, you know, our thinking and try to advance those those agendas. But those memos on the part of the outgoing administration, the incoming administration, they're really helpful, not just to the president, but to the incumbents who take over these roles, because they were written for them. And, you know, they're not going to be as useful in 2 months, because the situation is going to be changed. They're going to know more than anything that's in those memos, but they really help you come up to speed fast.
There are some more important things that we've barely had a chance to scratch the surface on. I would be remiss if I didn't point out that the wildfires in Maui last week are an example of how security threats can affect people in the most personal way. I think, Admiral Allen, you get asked about leadership in those circumstances everywhere you go. Would you want to say anything about that?
I'd be happy to. First of all, you can't, as we said earlier, can't exactly plan for the particular unique event that's going to occur. And just as there's a commingling of authorities and responsibilities when you have a disaster, what's prompting these disasters, anywhere from what's going on with the climate or producing these threats that I told you earlier, they're agnostic to agency boundaries and sometimes national physical boundaries. So in my view, what we need to continue to evolve is to approach these things. In the United States military, we would call it doctrine. It doesn't tell you exactly what to do, but it tells you general theories about how to think and how to organize what it is you're going to do. And in this case, it's confronting complexity on a scale we haven't seen before. And everything's going to be unique. In Maui, for instance, access is everything. It's a small island, and what it takes to fix the problems there are going to require access to that island that's never existed before in terms of materiel, whether it's by air or by sea or whatever. So that's going to require an extraordinary amount of coordination, not only between the state and the federal government, but with the military for their support to civil authorities. And that's where these exercises done properly and the relationships that are established, help to do that. One of the keys to ultimately to success in New Orleans was my ability to sit down with Lieutenant General Russ Honore, who led the Joint Task Force from U.S. Northern Command, and come up with a common purpose, a planning cell. There was no law that said we had to do it, and I had no legal authority. But we knew the best way to solve the problem was to combine everything, have a central planning cell, and agree to how we were actually going to get along. And in my article, I call it the doctrine of unity of effort, which ought to be an undergirding principle on how we approach these things going forward.
I would also say we've talked about interagency, but a key component is, when you look at all the stakeholders, is also private industry. And to a large extent, there are already established pathways or resources that people are much more aware of. An example I'll offer is the hurricane down in Puerto Rico. We thought we needed to send water and food. If we had been talking to private industry, we would have realized there's plenty of water and food. We need to transport the water and food, and we need to get comms down there. But we went, here's the battle plan, we're ready, instead of working that and cooperating and looking at all the information you have available about the site picture to make sure you're addressing what the right problem is.
And I'd be remiss in not mentioning this because I was dealing directly with the Assistant Secretary of Defense and people in the White House at the time. And I was almost pleading for the establishment of a joint task force, similar to what was sent to New Orleans after Katrina for Puerto Rico. And contrary to the request and the advice of the Department of Defense, the administration decided not to do that. And I think we paid for it ever since.
There's one more question I wanted to ask you, and I know we're out of time, but we touched a little bit on the different dynamics in 2024, and one of them is something that we encounter regularly. We have a first-term president who is campaigning for a second term. We also this time have a challenger candidate who's looking for a second term. So broadly speaking, is there anything different about preparing for a second term that these candidates should keep in mind? We know, I'll prime the pump, that when there are ongoing conflicts, it is a moment to think about a change in posture.
I want to say that transitions are a perilous moment. They're also actually really good, because what it signals is that we have a country where we bring in new blood, we bring in new ideas. We don't get calcified by having the same president for 20 years, or the same military head of the military for 20, 30 years. We turn people over, and sometimes between a first and second administration, some people who came in the first administration really need to think about whether there isn't a time to let someone else have a chance to do the job, because they're exhausting, and you might not realize just how much a toll it has taken. But people love it, and they love the responsibility, and they feel so fulfilled. They want to stay in those jobs, right? So it's both an opportunity to bring in new people, and there is some turnover, so that is good. It's also, as I was saying earlier, an opportunity to remind yourself, what were some of those other things we wanted to get done, some of those harder things. They say about the Pentagon, it's like trying to turn a battleship. It doesn't happen on a dime. So to the extent that there are always those who think that what you're talking about is not the right thing to do for the country, whether it's, change the nature, the nature of the Marine Corps units, or this pivot to Asia, or should we be more drone and manless in our autonomous in our fighting equipment as opposed to manned systems. And it's a good chance to kind of go back and say, let's think about what the right thing to do for the country is for the long term. Some of those things that it does take more like 4 years or 8 years, or sometimes you have to bang on the wall and some future administration who's finally going to be able to break through it, to get back to that longer term agenda, because you're there. You're not a newbie. So at this time, you should be able to take on bigger tasks.
Can I add just one comment, please? Sometimes you, not to quote somebody I've admired a long time, find the good and praise it. Find the good and praise it. There are a couple of exemplars that we could learn a lot from about this transition, and actually the value of public service and continuity. And I'll unabashedly call it out right now. Everything you've seen going on in the last 3 to 4 years with the airlines, cancellations, weather, everything else, you haven't heard anything about TSA. Think about it for a minute. The current administrator of TSA, Dave Pekoski, transitioned across both administrations. Came in during the Trump administration and now is in the Biden administration. And in my view, they've had the longest sustained period of high performance in the history of the agency. And I think we can find an exemplar like that and look at it, we should do it. I see Patty nodding here.
Well, having been part of the George H.W. Bush administration when we were outgoing, under the circumstances that I think Lewis talked about earlier, it was at the end of the first term, the only term of President Bush 41, but he nonetheless was committed to making sure this was a seamless operation. And so all of us had the instruction. This was way before 1992. Way before the condition of anything that's been enacted since that time, which has all been positive. All the enacted provisions are absolutely imperative to help assure that continuity. But first, that 92 experience taught me that it starts with the disposition, as Lewis said, tone at the top. If the president doesn't believe that, and everybody else believes that's what their duty is as public servants, this is always going to be a rocky road, regardless of how well you tune up the legislation, how much the law may enforce whatever provision involved, all of which are critical, all of which I think are terrific additions. But if we rely on that, number one has got to be the public judgment are the individuals who are going to be in leadership capacities going to have that kind of view that first and foremost we're serving all of the citizens of this country. And that's the reason why those transitions must be done. The most interesting, challenging transition I've ever been part of was the one we prepared for that didn't happen in 2004. Having been part of the Bush 43 administration, he was equally committed to saying, look, if everybody decides I need to go back to Crawford and that's the best place for me to be, he said, we got to make sure we hand this off properly. And even if we don't, even if we get another run at this, we've got to be thinking in terms of the fact that the reality is more than half of all the people who started in this administration are either leaving or they're already gone. And so we've got to be thinking about what those kinds of policies are. And I can recall this constant guidance, the best way to describe it, that the president issued in those cases, in which we had to be prepared for either direction of it. But his reminder was, it doesn't matter. It's still the same preparation. It's the same focus of this, whether he's in that capacity or someone else succeeds him in that role. He says, we're all here for a temporary period of time. No one has an entitlement to any of these capacities, starting, if that's the view that the president begins with, that's the solution that will come out of it. And ultimately, in 2008, when at the end of his second term, he did focus on the issue that Steve Adley and others, have written about extensively. This was the great virtue of that preparation, of really thinking in terms, this isn't about me, it's about what it is we're trying to do to preserve this really, really critical democratic experiment that is as fragile, we've learned, as anything. And it is something that if we take our eye off that ball, that's going to be the challenge. And so as citizens, pulling the lever and voting, it ought to be, to your question, a view of who do we think is going to be responsible about governance, less about what they believe they're entitled to, and more about what it is that will preserve this republic.
These are some good themes to end on. Transition is an opportunity to think about getting things right. The disposition from the top matters, and this is fragile and needs to be protected and preserved and cared for. I have the feeling that we've only scratched the surface of some shared stories among this group. We have a lot more that we could talk about, but I want to thank our panel for sharing their expertise with us today. You are at great risk of being hired here as spokespeople, so thank you for being here. Thank you to Protect Democracy, to Alexandra Chandler and Christine Kwan, to help host this event, to the partnership staff, Austin Loffersweiler, Maggie Moore, Abby Fine, and the partnership event staff for putting this all together. If you want to read more, please look up our report at www.presidentialtransition.org, and we will see you next time.